In Mark 8:22-26, Jesus heals a blind man in two stages, not by accident, but as a message. Before the disciples can see who Jesus is, they have to see how blind they really are. This story raises a few very serious questions, and by the end of the video, we'll have answers. Let's read verse 22 from the ESV. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. We last saw Jesus and the disciples in a boat with too many men and too little bread. Jesus warned them about the danger of becoming like the Pharisees and Herod, who see and hear what Jesus does, but still don't believe. Now, they arrive at Bethsaida Julius, a Gentile area on the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee. And some locals brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him for his healing touch. Intercession on behalf of a person in crisis is a repeated theme in Mark. Let's move on to verses 23 and 24. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees, walking." Before helping the blind man, Jesus led him out of the village. Why does he do that? Jesus has consistently resisted doing things in front of crowds because it causes the crowds to grow and limits his freedom of movement. The messianic secret will be easier to preserve if the number of witnesses is limited. Then, like the recent healing of another Gentile, a deaf mute, Jesus involves his saliva, which people believed worked as a medicinal ointment or salve, by spitting on his eyes and laying hands on him. Then Jesus did something very unusual. He asked the man if he could see anything. In all of the other healings in Mark's Gospel, Jesus speaks a word or touches someone, and immediately they are completely and instantly healed. What did the blind man say? He sees people, but they look like trees, presumably because they are undefined, as though covered in leaves. How does he know he's not seeing trees? Because they're walking, and trees don't walk. We need to note that this is the only occurrence in the Gospels of what looks like a failed or only partially successful healing attempt by Jesus. Hold on to that thought, because the heart of the story hangs on it. Let's move on to verse 25. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Ah, the second touch was the charm. Jesus touched him again, and his eyes opened, and his sight was restored. How restored was it? So that he saw everything clearly. People were clearly people. Trees were clearly trees. Everything was clear. Let's talk about the critical issue at hand. The two-step healing represents one of two possibilities. It either means that Jesus couldn't do it completely on the first try and needed a second go to effect a total healing, or the two-step process was used deliberately to make a point. The evidence that it's to make a point is contained in every other miracle of Jesus. He never needed a multi-step process with anyone else, up to and including resurrecting the dead. So the weight of the evidence seems to indicate that Jesus did this to illustrate a point. What point is that? The previous story was a warning to the disciples about becoming like the Pharisees and Herod, who saw and heard but didn't believe. If you go back and read that story, or watch the previous video, it is filled with references to sight and seeing. That's not a coincidence. What does that have to do with this healing? The two-step healing shows that a man who cannot see gets progressively clearer vision through more contact with Jesus. Jesus spits on his eyes and touches him, and he can see imperfectly. Jesus touches him again, and he can see clearly. The disciples have ongoing contact with Jesus, but were still arguing about their lack of bread on a boat trip, despite Jesus having fed two different multitudes. Their contact with Jesus should result in them having the clearest of all vision. And in the next story, Jesus will ask the disciples who they think he is. And in the pivotal moment of Mark's Gospel, Peter will proclaim that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, his eyes wide open and his vision clear. Let's look at verse 26. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Jesus sends him home, but with specific instructions not to even enter the village. This is probably the ultimate example of the messianic secret of Jesus trying to minimize the public reaction to miracles by telling the healed to keep it to themselves. That strategy has always resulted in bigger crowds. Now, Jesus says, "Don't even let the villagers, the people who brought you to me, see what I've done for you." Let's sum up what we've seen and what we can learn from it. The disciples have seen more than anyone, but they still seem to struggle with understanding their master. The healing of the blind man in 2 steps shows that repeated contact with Jesus results in progressively clarified vision. And next, in an epiphany, Peter will blurt out a full understanding of who Jesus is. What can we conclude? It seems certain that the 2-step healing wasn't necessary because of some degree of inability or a particularly difficult form of blindness. But for Mark's readers, including us, the message is clear. What you've seen and heard from Jesus should be revealing who he is with increasing clarity. We're about halfway through Mark's Gospel. Based on what you've seen and heard, what conclusions are you drawing about Jesus? Let me know in the comments. Next time, Jesus directly asks the disciples who they think he is, and Peter makes his bold confession. Thanks for studying with me. Please share the video with someone you think would like it.